He stopped failing. That was his downfall. 1. Marcus didn't trust himself anymore. Not because he had failed, because he had stopped failing. For 11 years, every decision he made was routed through the system first. Market entry, acquisition targets, personnel cuts, the timing of a phone call, the framing of a sentence before a board meeting. The system never missed. 31 consecutive quarters without a significant loss. A portfolio that institutional investors studied like scripture. A reputation built not on brilliance, but on something quieter and rarer consistency. His junior analysts called it the Oracle. Marcus called it Tuesday. He did not notice, in those 11 years, that something in him had gone very still. 2. There was a version of him younger, quieter, more dangerous, who felt things before he understood them. In his first fund, he had passed on a deal his partners wanted badly. The numbers were clean. The management team was credible. The market thesis was airtight. Every person in that room had done their homework, and the homework agreed. But something in the founder's eyes had moved wrong during the pitch. A half-second delay before answering a question about supply chain. Not hesitation, something more specific. The kind of stillness that arrives when a man is translating in real time from what is true to what is useful. Marcus had said no. He hadn't explained why. He wasn't sure he could. The company was in receivership 14 months later. He never told anyone about the eyes. He wasn't sure they would have believed him. He wasn't entirely sure he believed himself. 3. So when the system arrived first as a tool, then as a partner, then as something closer to a conscience, he welcomed it. It removed the embarrassment of intuition. No more defending a read on a person that couldn't be quantified. No more sitting across a table and trusting the animal part of himself. That had no spreadsheet, no precedent, no audit trail. No more saying something feels wrong to a room, full of people who needed it to feel right. The system had all of those things, and it was never embarrassed. Over time, Marcus found that the quiet voice, the one that had noticed. The founder's eyes grew harder to hear, not because it disappeared, because he stopped turning toward it. The skin prickling before a bad meeting, the tightening just below the ribs, when a number was technically correct but somehow dishonest. The particular quality of silence. In a room where someone was deciding whether to lie, he still felt these things dimly. The way you feel a draft from a window you stopped opening years ago. He had learned not to mention them. Why would he? The system was right 31 times in a row. 4. The CEO of the logistics company was named Renard. They met once, briefly, at an industry conference in Singapore. Renard was the kind of man who knew how to fill a room, without appearing to try easy posture, specific compliments, the gift of making his attention feel like a promotion. Marcus shook his hand. Something moved in his chest. Not alarm, not quite recognition. Something older than both. The faint percussion of a warning that had no name yet, arriving too early to be understood and too quiet to be believed. He filed it nowhere. 40 minutes later, his analyst had submitted the parameters. By morning, the system had returned its assessment. Low counterparty risk. Relationship history positive. No anomalies detected. Recommended maintain current exposure. Marcus was in Zurich the following week. When Renard's company requested the meeting, he delegated it. He did not attend. He was not in the same room as the man who was already, at that moment, dismantling the infrastructure of Marcus's largest holding from the inside. The fraud had been running for 22 months. Later, much later, Marcus would learn that 2 of his oldest partners had flagged something about Renard at an industry dinner the previous spring. Nothing they could name. Just the feeling, mentioned over the second glass, that the man was always performing a version of himself, slightly ahead of the one standing in front of you. They had mentioned it to Marcus. He had routed it through the system. No significant risk indicators identified. The loss was not catastrophic. That was almost the worst part. Manageable. Contained. The kind of number that makes trade publication headlines, but doesn't end careers. His lawyers were efficient. His communications team was faster. Within 6 weeks, the narrative had been reframed as an industry-wide failure of due diligence, which was partly true and entirely beside the point. Daniel left in the 7th week. 30 years. They had built the first fund together in a borrowed office, with no air conditioning, living on bad coffee, and the particular arrogance of men who believe they can read the world better than it reads itself. Daniel had been the one person Marcus allowed himself to say something feels wrong to without explanation. The one person who had always known what he meant. He came to Marcus's office at the end of a Tuesday. He did not shout. Daniel had never been a man who shouted. He said, "You didn't shake his hand." Marcus said, "I was in Zurich." Daniel said, "That's what I mean." He left the building carrying nothing, which meant he had packed his desk sometime earlier in the day, alone. While Marcus was in meetings, the system had recommended he attend. 6. There is a story his grandfather told him. Once, about a man in a northern village who stopped going outside in winter. The winters were brutal, so the man built better walls, then better insulation, then a system of pipes that warmed every room, from a single furnace in the basement. He was never cold. He was comfortable every day of every season. One spring, he walked outside for the first time in 4 months. He slipped on a patch of ice he hadn't seen. It wasn't that the ice was hidden. It was thin ice, the kind every child in that village learned to read before the age of 6. The particular translucency, the way it sat just slightly lower than the surrounding ground, the small dullness at its surface that meant it hadn't yet hardened through. The signs had always been there. He had simply stopped being a person who noticed them, not out of carelessness, out of something far more efficient than carelessness. He had built something so complete at keeping him safe. That safety itself had made him unable to survive. He lay in the snow for a long time before anyone came. The furnace ran perfectly. The walls held. Inside, everything was exactly the right temperature. By the time he noticed the ice, the part of him that once knew how to read it was already gone. The system was right about the numbers. It was only wrong about the man Marcus used to be.